front here. All those times that I told you that you should, hi guys, that you should practice your public speaking because someday you'll be really glad your teachers made you do it. I'm really glad right now that mine made you do it. Two things that I say to my students most are question and react. And we're so lucky in New Hampshire that we get to question candidates and react to what they have to say. And we have a great candidate here today. His name's
You're good.
I'm saying we have a great candidate here today. I'm going to stop, ladies and gentlemen, Beto O'Rourke.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you, everybody who's made some time to welcome us to Conway. Thank you to Tuckerman Brewing for making beer, for keeping people happy, and for hosting today. And thanks to all of you, especially the students who are here, who are getting involved in your democracy, our democracy. You take your role and your responsibility so seriously. And I haven't even been in your state 24 hours, and that is abundantly clear to me. The questions I've been asked, the thoughtfulness and the comments, the suggestions, the advice, the guidance, the ideas that you bring to bear in this national conversation that we're having right now, where we have a set of challenges we have never seen, at least in my lifetime, perhaps in this country's history. And you seem to be more than a match for what we face. And you also seem to be intent on helping the Democratic Party choose the best possible nominee. And I am constantly reminded, all of my 6.5 days as a presidential candidate, that we have an extraordinary field of candidates running right now from every walk of life, from every background, set of life experiences. Stunningly beautiful your state is. It's absolutely gorgeous. These dramatic mountains, the sheer rock faces that you see emerging out of tree-covered slopes, all this white stuff that you guys call snow, that we in El Paso are not as familiar with. Really, really beautiful. And I can understand why so many people come to this part of the state, come to this part of New England to visit and spend time. So you really got something here and can't wait to come back. So, I don't know, congratulations. I was thinking about how my part of the country, where Amy and I are raising our 3 kiddos, Ulysses, who's 12, Henry, who's 8, their sister Molly, who's 10 years old, we're in the Chihuahuan Desert, at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. Also dramatic, also gorgeous, just a lot different than where we are here. Also intent upon protecting our public lands, making sure that our heritage is preserved, that we have the opportunity to pass that on to the generations that follow. There are these 10,000 acres in just outside of the Franklin Mountains in El Paso, Texas, 7,000 of them known as Kastner Range. They are preserved Chihuahuan desert wilderness, where for the last 10,000 years, you have a record of human history in what is now my hometown. So the first people to live in what is now El Paso, Texas, left their impressions of their physical and maybe metaphysical observations of what is now the U.S.-Mexico border, left on rocks, left on the walls of caves, evidence of what they ate, how they hunted, how they lived part of our story, right? Part of our American story. And that land, owned by the Department of the Army, was potentially going to be sold for development, and we would lose it all forever, never be able to get it back. And so worked mightily as a member of Congress in the minority with the President Barack Obama administration, trying to get a declaration of a national monument. Our community, school kids, folks who've been working on this challenge for more than 50 years to protect these lands, did everything we could to try to convince the administration that this is worth their time, worth their investment of resources to protect this land. And we came up a little bit short. But that didn't deter us, that didn't stop us, and I continued on behalf of the 750,000 constituents whom I represented in the United States Congress to try to work towards a solution that came to us as a member of the House Armed Services Committee, writing in a protection in the National Defense Authorization Act for every one of those 7,000 acres for every year in perpetuity going forward. Worked with the Republican majority on my committee and in the House, found partners and common ground, consensus and common cause where we could. We're able to pursue that solution, get it inserted into the Senate version of the bill, and signed into law by a president who is actively working to diminish the size of our protected public lands. Here he was increasing them by 7,000 acres in a state where you would not expect to find it in Texas. And though he doesn't know that that protection is in the bill that he signed, more likely than not, we are grateful nonetheless that we've always been able to find a partner, work with anyone, anytime, anywhere, to advance the agenda of those whom we serve, to whom we are accountable, and for this great country. That's the way that I've been part of anything of any substance or consequence or significance in my life. I just passed a VA healthcare clinic. I served 6 years on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, every single day of those 6 years, with Annie Custer sitting literally right next to me on the committee. Both of us in those 6 years in the minority, the only way to get anything done for those whom we served was to find a Republican partner. If I came back to a meeting like this one, and I held an open town hall, all comers welcome, no holds barred, every single month, and said, you know what, you told me that El Paso ranked dead last in access to a mental health care provider for veterans. You had the longest wait times in the country, but those darn Republicans just won't get out of the way, won't work with me. They don't get things the way that we do. They don't like our veterans. My constituents would have called BS on me, as they should. If I came back and said, you gave me a great idea to expand mental health care access to veterans who return to this country after putting their lives on the line with an other than honorable discharge, a status of discharge that prevented them from even setting foot in that VA clinic here in New Hampshire or mine back in El Paso. If I said, look, I wrote the perfect bill, honor our Commitment Act, but those Republicans, I can't work with those guys. We got to wait till we change the composition of the House, wait till we have a different president in the White House to get anything done. They would have voted me out of office, as they should. Instead, we found a Republican colleague, a partner who had written his own version of the bill, a little bit different than ours. We compromised, a four-letter word amongst some, especially those with whom I used to work, found that consensus, ended up getting it passed 435-0 in the House of Representatives. Found every single partner that we could, made new ones where they weren't already there. In the Senate, got it passed there, and also signed into law by our current president, a man with whom I agree on almost nothing. And yet we were able to find enough common ground there to work together, not allowing the perfect to become the enemy of the good, having a healthy fear of those whom we represent, their judgment and their accountability. Something that I find missing in so much of our national politics today. It's not just the way in which I have served, it's the way in which I have campaigned. Many of you helped us in our race in the state of Texas to try to serve that state in the U.S. Senate. We traveled to every one of the 254 counties in that state. Did not matter how rural or how urban, how red or how blue. That county, King County, that voted for Donald Trump 96% in the last election, we showed up to Guthrie the county seat because we believe, as do you, they're every bit as deserving of our respect, of being heard, of being listened to, of being fought for. We have to show up before we can ever expect to earn their vote or serve them or do justice to their confidence and their faith in these democratic institutions. And though we came up a little bit short in that election, 2.6% for those who are counting, we got to be part of something absolutely transformational for our state, for me personally, for everyone who had a chance to be part of this campaign. A state that had been dead last in voter turnout, 50th in the country, not because we love our democracy any less than you do here in New Hampshire, but we were drawn that way. It was on purpose and by design. Because of your race, your ethnicity, your country of national origin, you might be drawn out of a congressional district so that your vote might be diluted. And so some people decided not to vote. You can use your ID to carry a weapon in Texas. You cannot use your ID as a student at any one of our universities to prove who you are at the ballot box in Texas. And yet, we were able to transcend and overcome those barriers and those obstacles. Young voter turnout in Texas in 2018 up 500% from the last midterm year. Total turnout in the state approaching presidential election year turnouts. And though we did not win our race, there were 2 congressional seats long held by Republicans, now held by Democrats. There are 17 African American women in Harris County elected to judicial positions of power, authority, and public trust, literally changing the face of criminal justice reform in our largest city, in the most diverse city in the United States of America. And those changes will continue going forward. They're positive, they are profound, they will ensure that more voices are heard, more votes are counted, more people run for office and take part in their democracy. And beyond my pride as a Texan in what we see happening in our state, I think this is fundamentally necessary. And you all get it, given your role as the first primary state, absolutely fundamental to any prospect we hold of being able to meet the historic challenges we have before us. A healthcare system, though we live in the wealthiest, the most powerful, the most technologically and medically advanced country that mankind has ever known, there are millions of our fellow Americans who cannot see a doctor or take their child to a therapist or afford their prescriptions even when they have insurance. The copay is too high. I just met a woman. Costs for her prescription medication, this is just one medication, totals $10,000 a year. This is after insurance has kicked in. She's supposed to take 3 pills a day, but she can't afford to do that. So she scrimps on her medication so that she can both stay alive and stay within a budget. We have people in this country dying of diabetes in the year 2019, dying of the flu, dying of curable cancers, because we have not yet formed the political will to make investments in people and their success and their health and their ability to be well enough to finish an education, go to work, start a business, write a poem, whatever they're supposed to do over the course of their lives. It accrues to our common benefit if they are well enough to do it. Hard to do that. Hard to do that in an economy that is working too well for too few, not working well enough for the rest of us. How can it be that this country has produced people who have an extra $3 or $4 million in an attempt to game the college admissions process, and there are some families who don't have an extra $300 or $400 to make the down payment on their child's tuition at a 4-year university, at a community college, at a trade school? There needs to be greater equality of opportunity in this country, or, as Teddy Roosevelt said, in response to that era's concentration of wealth and power and privilege, you cannot have something approaching political democracy in this country unless you have something approaching economic democracy in this country. Every single child needs a future in the United States of America. We need to break up the concentration of power and wealth and privilege so that everyone has a shot, regardless of where they live, how rural, how urban, or regardless of any other difference of race, of faith, of gender, of your immigration status, how many generations you can count back that your family was here, or whether your family just got here a few days ago. All that matters at the end of the day is that we're in this country together. And for this country to be successful, every single one of us needs a shot. When I think about my kiddos, when I think about your kids, when I think about our grandkids and the generations yet to come, I think about the greatest existential challenge the human race has ever faced. Scientists, beyond the shadow of a doubt, tell us that thanks to our own excess and inaction, this globe has warmed more than 1 degree Celsius since 1980. The trajectory that we are on all but guarantees us more of these wildfires and floods and droughts, more death and suffering, more migration and flows of refugees all over the world. 400,000 apprehensions on our southern border may sound like a lot, but it is nothing compared to what we will see when entire countries near the equator in this hemisphere no longer can support human life. If we want there to be a life worth living for the people of the future, our descendants from this moment right now, those same scientists tell us there are 12 years within which to act, to take bold, defining change, to free ourselves from a dependence on fossil fuels, to invest in renewable energy and the high-wage, high-skill, high-value jobs that come with them, and to reassert our leadership on the global stage so that America, the lone country that has exited from the Paris Climate Agreement, once again becomes the indispensable nation with the power to convene the other nations of this planet on our common challenges, on otherwise intractable problems. For any of this to be possible, fairness in our economy, an ability for all of us to be well enough to pursue our purpose, combating climate change before it is too late, this democracy, currently so captured and corrupted by corporations and special interests, must work again. Every vote counted, every voice heard. Our institutions responding to people instead of corporations and PACs and lobbyists. For all of these reasons, we are running a campaign that goes everywhere, regardless of how red or how blue, how small or how large. Listening to everyone, never defining ourselves by our differences or the fear that we may be provoked to feel, but instead known by our ambitions and our aspirations, the great work that we want to accomplish, and the resolve, the tenacity, the ingenuity, and the creativity that will allow it to come to pass. For these reasons, together, to help to unite a very deeply divided country, I am running to serve you as the next president of the United States of America. And I am grateful to be here, grateful for this opportunity, and looking forward to listening to you, to hearing what's on your mind, to seeing things from your perspective, and hopefully to come back and meet you again. I think we have, or do not have another microphone, so if you...
I'll bring them up if you want to.
You can either come up here and we can hand you the microphone, or I can call on you and you can use your outside voice inside, and we'll all be able to hear you. But I want to make sure that I have a chance to hear you out, to listen to you, and to respond to your questions.
All right, we have our first.
Yes, sir, with the button, and then I'll come over here with the red vest.
My name is Steven, and I'm an ACLU voter from the prioritize civil liberties when I cast my ballot. And an issue of doing work to me is mass incarceration, so I want to know what you will do to end mass incarceration that predominantly affects people of color with those disabilities.
Thank you for the question. It's about mass incarceration, about a criminal justice system that has produced the largest prison population on the face of the planet. In this country, what is supposed to be the world's greatest democracy, if we cherish our freedoms, if we value our independence and our liberty, why are we locking so many of our fellow Americans up? Somebody said money. If you think about the private prisons who have a profit incentive to keep more people locked up, who have the resources to come and lobby members of Congress to argue for mandatory minimums, throw in the book at people who have committed non-violent drug offenses like possession of marijuana, a substance that is legal in more than half the states of the Union. And though Americans of all races and ethnicities use cannabis at the same rate, only some are more likely than others to be arrested, to do time behind bars, to upon release be forced to check a box that says they have a conviction on every employment application form, who will not be eligible for federally backed student loans, so they will not get a higher education and live to their full potential. Some people call this system of justice the new Jim Crow, because that prison population is disproportionately brown and black. It narrows options and constrains the futures of those who are caught up in it. So one of the first steps that we must take is to end the federal prohibition on marijuana. The second step, expunge the arrest records of everyone arrested simply for possessing something that is already legal in so many other states. And then thinking about this VA clinic and the number of veterans that I have met who are hooked on opioids that were lawfully prescribed to them by a VA doctor who wishes that she could have prescribed medical cannabis instead, knowing full well that her patient, that veteran who put his or her life on the line for this country, might become addicted and might be one of the 70,000 of our fellow Americans who lost their lives to overdose deaths right now. A sensible drug policy ensures that we save more of those lives, get more of those veterans back on their feet, help to treat them for the post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury that they came back with after serving this country. And oh, by the way, if we're going to talk about criminal justice reform and the opioid addiction crisis that we have in New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, where we just were yesterday, and throughout so much of this country, let's understand why we have it in the first place. If we are 4% of the globe's population, and yet we consume 85% of its opioids, and those who are using heroin and fentanyl in this country began their addiction with lawfully prescribed drugs in almost every single one of those cases. Purdue Pharma, its executives, who knew full well the addictive properties of what they were selling to doctors and prescribers, who in turn were giving it to their patients, has faced no accountability in any meaningful way at all thus far for the tens of thousands of deaths those prescription drugs have caused. So you have young men and women rotting behind bars for marijuana. And you have people who have caused real death and destruction in our communities going scot-free. This criminal justice system must be equal. No man, no woman, no corporation is above or below the law. Equal justice for all. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I've got two questions. The first one has to do with your family. Forgive the personal question. How do you plan to protect your wife and your children and your parents, anybody in your family, from the toxic smear campaign that is going to come your way? And the second one is, how do you plan to defeat Joe Biden in particular?
So when it comes to family, I'm grateful for the question and for the compassion inherent, implied in the question. You want to make sure that our politics is about policies, about vision, about our record, about what we want to do for the country and how we're going to do it together. As someone much smarter than I am sent to me in a text the other day, given the challenges that we face, even those that we have just described so far today, with many others that we can think about. We cannot approach this with half measures or with half the country. It's got to be all of us. We've never been more divided than we are at this moment. We've never seen the level of pettiness and meanness and smallness from the highest office in the land like we are seeing right now. We can either succumb to that and return the smears in kind, or we can keep this conversation elevated where it belongs. And that's what I intend to do. Now, whether that comes at some consequence or cost politically or in the election, I'm willing to take that risk. Knowing full well that any family, your families as well, when you become engaged civically, democratically with a small d, when you get involved in the democracy of this country, which I firmly believe, to echo Abraham Lincoln, is the last best hope of Earth, given the challenges that this planet faces today, then all of us are going to have to sacrifice to some degree. El Paso, Texas, my hometown, is also home to Fort Bliss. 32,000 active duty service members, home of the 1st Armored Division. So many of them have fought in so many of our wars, 18 years and counting in Afghanistan, 27 and counting in Iraq, in Syria and Somalia and Libya and Yemen in addition. So we know as a country, and probably many here actually have experienced this, real service and sacrifice. And what we are doing right now, what I am doing, what the O'Rourke family is doing, pales in comparison with what those men and women who are deployed right now are doing. I keep that in mind, what their kids are going through. And when we're talking to Ulysses and Molly and Henry about this, we say, look at this. Everyone is putting in a little bit right now. Everyone's going to serve and sacrifice so that this is a better world and a better country for you. And so I'm going to keep my focus on that. As far as Joe Biden, I hope he gets into the race. I do. You know why? Because this guy has in so many ways defined service to his country as well. Serving in the United States Senate, serving for the little guy and the little gal, keeping a dignity in how he conducts himself, never taking himself too seriously, being able to laugh at himself, serving in the second most important position in this country, the vice presidency, a heartbeat away from leading the free world. So for his service, for his sacrifice, for his contributions to our democracy and to the conversation we're having right now, I hope he gets into the race. I want all of us to have the benefit of the greatest, the most diverse field the Democratic Party has ever put forward in the nominating process, and I think he should be part of it. So thank you for asking the question.
Hi, Congressman. Thanks for coming to Conway. To coin a phrase, those who forget their history are doomed to repeat it. So what event or period of history do you feel like we're most in danger of forgetting at our peril?
Wow. What a great question. I think you have to go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century to see this kind of concentration of power and wealth and privilege. And in much the same way that period provoked a progressive response, you have the direct election of U.S. senators because we were sick of that happening behind closed doors with only the powerful invited, already those in power, preventing those who sought the ability to shape this country in their own image, to reflect their voice and their vote. You had the breakup of monopolies and trusts. You had accountability, the great muckraking journalists of that period, who held the powerful, whether they were in office or in business, accountable for their actions so that the public understood what was happening. We need that right now. We need to value our institutions, which are undergoing the greatest pressure test of our lifetime. The press, attacked as the enemy of the people by the president, when we all know and believe, and I hope you feel, they are the best defense against tyranny. This democracy doesn't work unless they are reporting the stories. Our ballot box, attacked from without this country by foreign powers, attacked from within. A cynicism, a partisanship, a polarization that we have never seen before. If we cannot bridge these divides, we're not coming back together against the really big stuff, the threats, the challenges, the opportunities before us. We think about how our information and our lives are sometimes used without our consent. A Congress that passes a bill that allows internet service providers to take your private browsing data and sell it to the highest bidder without your consent. And if you can think about the weirdest, darkest places you've been on the internet, do you want anybody having access to that? Why would your member of Congress, present member of Congress excluded, why would a member of Congress ever vote for that when it is at such odds to the consumer interests and protections that they purport to value? If you follow the influence of money, the bigger the money, the bigger the influence, these political action committees, which literally are able to steer the direction of the committees of jurisdiction before which they appear, are able to buy the outcomes of elections and legislation. This is a consequence to our democracy of this concentration of power. It is one of the reasons we do not take a dime from a single PAC or lobbyist. It's all people in every single one of the states. If we, like that previous generation of progressives, can return power to people, can ensure that our democracy works again, can acknowledge, as TR did, that our democracy is connected to our economy, both are connected to our ability to face these challenges, then I think we're going to be okay. But this is our defining test and moment of truth. We cannot be found wanting. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'd like to know your stance on the embargo in Cuba and if you have any plans to change it.
The question is about our embargo with Cuba and if we have any plans to lift it. Going all the way back to Bay of Pigs, up through the Trump administration and the hardline tactic they have taken against Cuba, not any one of those actions has produced the intended result. When we step back and look at the bigger picture of our involvement in the domestic affairs of other countries, the CIA-led overthrow of the Jacob Arbenz Guzman regime in Guatemala in the 1950s, Mossadegh in that same decade in Iran, our involvement in all those countries that I just mentioned earlier, where we are still at war tonight. Tell me that the trillions that we have spent, the thousands of American lives lost, the tens of thousands of lives taken in our name by our fellow Americans, have made things better for the people in those countries or better for this country. Our foreign policy right now is born on the backs of 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds fighting in endless wars which have not defined victory or the strategy to achieve it, which continues to pile on to $22 trillion in debt and $1 trillion more spent now every single year. We can either continue to do the same thing the same way and expect a different result, or we can remember Albert Einstein, who told us that is the very definition of insanity, and have the humility of understanding that we cannot control the actions of other countries, change their governments for them, no matter how odious or awful we find them to be. So I want to make sure, to answer your specific question, that yes, we lift the impositions on Cuba. We allow those people to receive access to the food and the medications so that they can thrive. We show the world that this country can be a good partner and a good friend, does not choose friends of convenience. Doing this to Cuba for the last 60 plus years and turning a blind eye to Saudi Arabia, their murder of journalists, their indiscriminate bombing campaign in Yemen, the millions of people who face starvation, dehydration, and death there because they are an ally. Let's be consistent in our values, in our morals, and in our foreign policy. Let's ensure that we lead with diplomacy, follow up militarily when needed, instead of the other way around, which is what we have been doing for far too long in this country. Thanks for the question.
Have time for a few more.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. My name is Steven, and I'm an ACLU voter, which means I prioritize civil liberties when I cast my ballot. And an issue you touched on earlier was voting rights in relationship to in relationship to college students in Texas. And I want to know what you will do to ensure that everyone has the right to vote, and that therefore there's no expungement, no suppression, or whatsoever. Yeah.
So how do we get more people engaged in our democracy? How do we ensure that our democracy is up to the challenges that I just described? I mentioned getting big money out of politics. I mentioned confronting the challenge of Citizens United, which declares that corporations are people, money is speech, and therefore corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money to affect legislation and the outcomes of elections. We need to make sure, even if it includes a new constitutional amendment, that this kind of democratic power is reserved only for human beings, real live people, and not corporations. We need to make sure that in states like mine in Texas, one of the most gerrymandered and racially gerrymandered at that in the union, that we do not allow members of Congress to choose their voters, that it is the other way around. We have citizen-led, nonpartisan, no politicians like me allowed in the room, redistricting commissions so that every vote and every voice is represented. We end the racist voter ID laws that we have through so much of this country. We pass and I sign into law a new Voting Rights Act, especially in those states of the former Confederacy, which ever since the Civil War ended have been actively suppressing the votes of African American members of their communities, ensuring that their genius, their potential, their voice is not part of our democracy. Not only do they lose out, we all lose out when that is the case. Same-day voter registration, making sure that we make it very easy for you to cast your vote and that your vote goes to the intended person. Those are some things that we could work on together.
All right, these are our last two.
Again, thank you for being here today. So millennials is our largest voting bloc, and they didn't come out well in 2016. What are you going to do to capture that group of voters?
I think when we acknowledge that young people in this country are not the leaders of tomorrow, they're the leaders right now of this moment on issues like gun violence. The House just passed universal background checks. Now, with all credit due to the members who voted for that, the real credit goes to the young people who forced the conversation, who led the walkouts in our high schools, the marches for our lives all across the country. They made that happen. And if we think about the history of significant change, especially change in civil rights, it's almost always been connected to the leadership of young people. The lunch counter in 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, the Freedom Riders on those Greyhound buses throughout the Deep South, those who walked with John Lewis, himself a young man at the time, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in 1968 with United Farm Workers striking to make sure that those who put the food on your table are paid a living wage and recognized for their service to this country. Young people have brought about the change that we need. We thank Lyndon Baines Johnson for signing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but it was young people who forced him to do it, and they will be the ones who force us on these issues that I just described. Hard for me to go to an event like this, especially if young people are present, where they don't bring up the issue of school shootings, because they are in school and they're doing active shooter drills in their schools, and they know that we lose 30,000 of our fellow Americans every year to gun violence senselessly, because we know that we can enact the laws that will save their lives. Not just universal background checks, but making sure that weapons that were designed, engineered, sold to the United States military for the express purpose of killing people as effectively, as efficiently, and as great a number as possible, ensuring that those weapons are no longer sold in our communities unless we want to see these kind of mass casualty shootings again and again. So climate change, gun violence, healthcare, you name it, young people are there. And recognizing that in Texas, in this last campaign that we ran, putting those young people at the forefront of our campaign is why young voter participation in Texas was up 500% from the last midterm year. That's the same way that we run this national campaign. Put those young people at the front, allow them to be the vanguard of what we are doing right now. Thank you.
This is our last question, but if you'd like to stay to take a quick picture for whoever who wants to stay, the line will be right here, and we'll stay for a little bit right after.
Congressman, thank you for being here. My name is Fiona, and I graduated about 9 months ago from Connect High School, right down the road. And you just set up my question perfectly. So you might know that, or you might not know that Keene, New Hampshire, in the past few years, their police department acquired a tank. You might not know that Sig Sauer, a German weapons manufacturing company, was kicked out of Europe because of their sensible legislation and regulations, and now they work out of New Hampshire, exporting guns to places like Mexico and Colombia, which are riddled with violence that is affecting people the world over. So I really appreciate what you said about your goals of curbing violence in our own communities, but what are you going to do to demilitarize our police, stop the senseless killing of countless people of color every year at the hands of police, and what are you going to do to stop the exports of weapons to countries that we have contributed to destroying, and how are you going to tie our communities to the greater world in creating justice and safety for all?
Thank you, Fiona. That was an excellent question. I hope that I can do it some justice. You talk about the militarization of our police forces. We lay the blame for that not at the feet of police or sheriff's deputies, but members of Congress who have made it this way. A war on drugs has become a war on people, a war on some people more than others. Our friend from the ACLU who asked a couple of questions, if we value the Constitution and our private property rights and our rights against unreasonable search and seizure, then what is going on in communities across the America of doors battered down, of people shot who are unarmed, all in pursuit of those who are in possession of drugs, in some cases drugs like marijuana, to which you're not going to become addicted, which you will not overdose with, which may in fact alleviate pain that you feel from the cancers from which you suffer, the glaucoma that you have. This makes no sense at all, and it's an incredibly expensive, deadly, violent way for us to police our communities. You talk about our selling weapons of war to countries all over the world and becoming the arms maker and seller of choice. President Trump said out loud that one of the reasons he does not want to hold Saudi Arabia culpable for what Saudi Arabia has done because of the billions of dollars that they will spend with U.S. corporations here in this country. No amount of arms sales, no amount of money flowing in from these brutal dictatorships that don't recognize the rights of women, that torture and kill their own citizens, that inflict unimaginable harm on their neighbors in the case of Yemen, is worth that kind of income to this country. So I mentioned earlier, being consistent in our values, in our morals, in our foreign policy, as well as our domestic policy, those are two ways in which we could do it. Thank you for the question. Thank you all for having us out here today. Huge honor for me. I am grateful. Thank you very much.